when you're moving from place to place, place. Good morning, good morning, morning.
Welcome back to the morning show on Tobago Updates. I am Adanna Combie, and we continue conversations this morning as we speak with Mr. Allan Stewart, and he is the director of TEMA, Tobago Emergency Management Agency, and we're talking today about disaster risk management. Good morning, Mr. Stewart, and welcome to the Tobago Updates morning
Good morning,
show.
and good morning to your viewers as well. It's a pleasure to be back here once again.
Right.
Good.
So we're talking disaster risk management. Tell us, what is disaster risk management and what we need to put in place or look forward to, or what we need to have in place?
Throughout the world of as it relates to managing disaster risk, the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction consider risk management as it relates to disasters to be one that ought to be very comprehensive in nature. And it looked at the entire disaster management cycle. So when we talk about disaster risk management, we are not only looking at response, we are looking at the issues related to how do you prepare, how do you prevent, how do you mitigate, how do you respond, and how do you recover, or what some may consider to have rehabilitation or get back on your feet, things like that, or get back to normalcy once again. And these are the major elements that one must take into consideration when you're looking at disaster risk management. For us here in Tobago, we have been influenced by a number of mandates, some of which are regional, some are national in scope, and some are international recognized. As I pointed out, how the UN ISDR look at it comprehensively. And I recalled just before 2005, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, at that time they were called CIDERA. They would have led the region in this whole concept of comprehensive disaster management. And I think it is very imperative that we as a nation embrace those concepts, because as we look at the emerging risks and the way in which these hazards are impacting our islands, and when I say islands, I'm referring to the whole archipelago of islands across the Eastern Caribbean, and what obtains as it relates to the impact with hydrometeorological events and the toll that they are having on small developing island states. These SIDS are considered to be small island states, and therefore it's important that we continue to look at resilience as the way going forward.
Right. And we're talking about disaster risk management, but what are some of the things we term as disaster? What is a disaster? For those of our viewers who are, okay, so is it just hurricane, flood? What are we considering as disasters that we are preparing this risk management conversation about?
You would have heard me mention that I mentioned what I said was, I spoke to the hazards. In many times, persons confuse the hazards with disasters.
Mm-hmm.
Disasters is a result of the impact of the hazard itself.
Right.
So one must be able to differentiate between the both. They present themselves in two types. One, you may have what you call anthropogenics, meaning therefore actions taken by human beings that result in a hazard impacting an exposed society. And these exposure, we are talking about our infrastructure, we are speaking about our ecosystem, our environment, we are speaking about our spatial development and where we built and how we built. And therefore, these exposures lend itself to the risk factors that we are now speaking about. So you have the hazard, The other thing is, what is these hazards exposed to? Are they exposed to houses that are not well built? Are they exposed to, or the houses, are they exposed to disasters that could, or hazards that could easily impact them? And as a result of that, you have a disaster on your hands. So in essence, a disaster is classified as the impact of a hazard upon which what is exposed to the hazard cannot withstand it, cannot recover from it properly, and therefore it overwhelm those persons who are impacted by it. So it's an emergency that goes beyond, as the old people will say, water more than flour. So if you have a situation like that and you cannot cope with it, where these shocks are concerned, then this is what is considered to be a disaster.
Okay, and so now we're planning for these disasters. How do we get ourselves out of them? Because in your preamble, you spoke about preparing for the disaster and recuperating after the disaster.
Yes. So there are 5 elements that one may want to lend thought to. One is prevention, or one is preparedness. For example, what we are doing this morning, we are preparing our population by way of education and providing information that person can make proper judgment and react. One of the most important things is to be well informed, where you understand the hazards which you are exposed to. And then you want to make sure that how you prepare through education, procurement of items, ensuring that families across the societies have an emergency plan, things like that, in terms of readiness for any eventuality. But apart from that, there may be issues that you can undertake. For example, your infrastructure. I always say the disaster management system is as simple as a story about the fox. Was it fox or the wolf and the pigs? They build this house out of straw, and they puff and blow it down. They build it again. There was a repeat, and then they decide to build it with brick. And so there came the resilience. And that is the level that in all of these sectors that we speak about, whether it's our technological advancement, our utilities, these things have to be hardened where we can prevent these occurrences and prevent things from the impact of the hazards upon us, turning it into a disaster. Another crucial area that you may want to lend thought to in the disaster management cycle is mitigation. My simple explanation as relates to mitigation is like how we use our roadways. For example, I think you have to be about between 17 to 18 years of age before you can drive on the nation road. Then we regulate how people drive on the road. You must drive on the left-hand side on the road. You give way to vehicular traffic on your right. So in instances where you cannot prevent an accident from happening, or the hazard from taking place in the form of MVA, you have regulation that regulate the way in which people use the roadway to reduce the impact of something occurring. And this comes through, again, through educational programs. So you cannot prevent it, you cannot stop it, but you can reduce the impact through legislative agenda, through policies, through things that you do that will reduce the impact of the risk or hardening of your infrastructure. And when we talk about infrastructure, it's not just about bricks and stone. We are talking about, more importantly to me, in this space, is we are speaking about things like our utilities. We have recognized over time that is our utilities hardened towards, in terms of that level of the infrastructure, against the type of hazards they are up against. Heavy rainfall, wind type, things like that. So these are some of the steps. But outside of that all, you have the element. You may talk about disaster prevention. You may tell a person, the fire service could go around and talk about fire prevention, but a house will burn down, and therefore it requires a response. Response in the disaster management cycle is identified as actions taken before the impact of a hazard and immediately after. How do you respond to it? And it's imperative that as an island, as a country, as a region, that we have an effective response mechanism. And yes, there is a disaster response mechanism. We see it played out overnight where the Cabo Star ran into some problems. And I must say that, my heroes this morning is the staff members of the Cabo Star. I was very nervous very early this morning as to whether or not they would have been able to extinguish that fire, and they did. And therefore, they are our heroes this morning. They were able to respond effectively because there was some level of preparedness. There was some level of well-known standard operating procedures and protocols to follow. If there is supposed to be and I heard the voice of the captain of that vessel, and he sounded very composed during the entire ordeal. And that speaks volume to our ability in some quarters to respond effectively. I think, in all honesty, one of the major weak areas in the entire disaster management cycle is that of the recovery effort. If you were to pay attention to what happened in 1997, the earthquakes, it took us a while before we could even have back a library. You recognize that? Our whole generation, the young men in my home, they did not experience a library. And therefore we have to speak to those issues. We look at the last year impact of the rainfall. There are roads within the 1 mile radius of where we are sitting that have not been rehabilitated. And therefore, it's a weak area in the system where we cannot get back to normalcy as quickly as we can, or we cannot rehabilitate or have reconstruction as the way in which. So these are the elements. And therefore, in closing, I would like to point out that it's important that we build back better. We build back stronger. We take into consideration the risk factors that are involved. The levels of probabilities is what triggers or measure or make that risk greater or higher or lower or medium term based on the levels of probabilities. It's like crossing the highway 2 o'clock in the morning and trying to cross the highway
4
8
o'clock
in the afternoon.
Right.
The probability of you being knocked down is quite high around 4 o'clock if you don't cross properly.
That's right.
So these are some of the elements and the nitty-gritty of it and how we need to plan going forward.
So if I'm a good student, disaster risk management basically is assessing the possibility of a disaster.
Yes.
Preparing yourself for the outcomes that could happen, and also, if it should happen, how we rehabilitate from it.
Yes, how we absorb those shocks.
Right. And of course, we have to put some emphasis, as you mentioned, on rehabilitation, because there are things that still under rehabilitation right now. So we need to put some emphasis on that so we could move quickly and smoothly into restoring ourselves back to a good way, a good standard of living in comfort and safety.
Yeah, because we live in a climate today where the probabilities of reoccurrence of these impact, and it looks very shameful when you have been hit by the same, like a boxer being knocked down by the same punch over and over and over. It looks clumsy, So we have to be able to learn from our errors, and it speaks to resilience. We have to build resilience in the various quarters of our, as I mentioned, infrastructure, our ecosystems, our health sectors need to be stronger. A number of different areas have to be well thought out as to how we deal with these pending hazards that we're up against.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Stewart. We've been speaking with Allan Stewart, the director of TEMA Tobago Emergency Management Agency, talking about disaster risk management. And we've learned a few things, and we are hoping we can implement them and move into a safe space with quick rehabilitation. Ladies and gentlemen, we take a break before we continue our show. But of course, we ask you to stay with us and to also share the live, share the live, share the live. We'll be back.
Put a smile on your face.